If you've been scrolling through endless lists of workstations, watching videos about core counts and RAM speeds, and still feel like you might end up with a box that looks impressive on paper but falls short when you actually sit down to edit a video or run a simulation, this review is here to clear that up. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. When you're spending a few $1,000s on a machine that's supposed to be the backbone of your creative workflow, the risk of buying the wrong thing feels a lot like buying a car without taking it for a test drive first, except the engine is a processor and the fuel is your time. The HP Z1 G1i is marketed as a high-end tower aimed at professionals who need serious compute power. It arrives in a sleek black chassis, houses an Intel Core Ultra 9285 processor, 64GB of DDR5 memory, a 1TB SSD, and a 500W power supply. On the surface, those numbers tick most of the boxes you'd see in a spec sheet for a modern workstation. But the real question is how those components behave together when you're actually running Photoshop, Blender, or data analysis software day in day out. First, let's talk about who this machine is built for. If you're a freelance video editor who regularly works with 8K footage, a CAD engineer juggling large assembly files, or a machine learning researcher training models that need both CPU and GPU horsepower, the Z1's Core Ultra 9, while not a dedicated server-grade Xeon, still offers 16 cores and 24 threads. In real-world tests that users have shared on forums, that kind of core count lets you keep your main editing timeline open while simultaneously rendering a background export without the system grinding to a halt. The 64GB of DDR5 is another practical win. It gives you enough headroom to run multiple virtual machines or keep large datasets in memory, which is something many budget-friendly workstations simply can't do without hitting swap. On the flip side, if you're a small business owner whose daily tasks are limited to email, spreadsheet work, and occasional web browsing, you'll likely never tap into the full potential of that CPU or that memory pool. In those cases, you'd be paying a premium for horsepower you'll never use. The same goes for gamers. The Z1 is a workstation, not a gaming rig, and while you could pair it with a high-end graphics card, the motherboard and power supply are designed with professional workloads in mind, not the latest DirectX-driven titles. So, the sweet spot for this machine is definitely the creative professional segment, not the casual user. Now, let's get into the practical strengths that matter beyond the headline specs. The 1TB NVMe SSD is a speed-focused decision. When you launch Adobe Premiere Pro, the difference between a sluggish, load-heavy timeline and a near-instantaneous preview is noticeable, especially on large projects. Users who have migrated from older SATA drives to a similar NVMe setup report cut down waiting times on file imports and export queuing. The 500W power supply, while modest compared to some high-end workstation builds that push 800W, is more than adequate for a single GPU and the Core Ultra processor. It also means the system runs cooler and quieter than some overspec'd rigs that constantly fan up. In real office environments, that translates to a less distracting hum, which is a subtle but appreciated quality when you're focused on design work. One of the less obvious strengths is the inclusion of an English keyboard in the package. For many international buyers, the cost of a separate mechanical keyboard that matches the aesthetic of a black tower can add up. Getting a functional, well-spaced keyboard right out of the box saves both money and time, especially for those who need to start working immediately after unboxing. The tower's layout also accommodates easy upgrades. The front panel gives quick access to the SSD bay, and the interior has room for a full-height graphics card, an additional storage drive, or even a second SSD. That modularity is something professionals appreciate because it lets you plan for future expansion without having to replace the entire chassis. The downsides, however, are worth pointing out before you click Add to Cart. First, the HP Z1 G1i does not come with a pre-installed graphics card. For a workstation that will be handling video rendering or 3D modeling, you'll need to budget for a separate GPU, often a mid-range to high-end RTX or Quadro depending on your software's certification requirements. That extra cost can push the total spend well above $2,500, which is something to factor into your overall budget. Second, the system's front ports are limited to USB-C and a headphone jack. You'll need to rely on the rear panel for additional USB-A ports or Ethernet connectivity. If your typical setup involves plugging in multiple peripherals like external drives, a drawing tablet, and a wired network connection, you may end up buying a small USB hub or a PCIe USB-A expansion card. It's not a deal breaker, but it's an extra step that some buyers miss in the initial spec glance. Another practical concern is the absence of dedicated